One of the most influential composers of the 20th century was the American John Cage, whose works were not only revolutionary, but sought to redefine music itself. Trained for a time by the Viennese composer Arnold Schoenberg, whom he worshipped, Cage would not only produce works of extraordinary uniqueness, but would also attempt to introduce completely new ideas about what the nature of music was. Hello everyone, for those who don't know me, I'm John, and today in this video we're going to take a look at the philosophy behind the music of John Cage, and see how it is a radical departure from the long-standing Western tradition on the nature of music. Before we begin, some preliminary remarks. First, I firmly believe that the music of any composer is an embodiment of his worldview, whether stated or implicit. This is just an unavoidable truth, but also the philosophy behind the music of any composer is something I want to get into more when I can, as it will help deepen the analysis of the music itself, I think. Second, the idea that the definition of music is whatever people want it to be is actually, I think, a pretty new idea. Until about the 20th century, there was in the West a generally accepted consensus about what the nature of music was, regardless of any disagreements about style and conventions, and there have been many. This idea began with Pythagoras in ancient Greece and continued to resonate down the centuries until modern times. It was only recently that this philosophy became the minority opinion. All this being said, I want to do two things in this video. First, we will go over the history of this ancient philosophy of music and see how it continued down the centuries, even until modern times. Then we will go over the philosophy of John Cage and see how it is a radical departure from this philosophy of music. And just one quick note, much of what follows will be based on Robert R. Riley's essay, The Music of the Spheres, or The Metaphysics of Music, and I'll try to include a link for this essay in the description below in case you want to read it. Anyway, back to the video. Around the 5th century BC, the ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras began conducting experiments that led to the discovery of the octave, the fifth, and the perfect fourth. The octave is a ratio of 2 to 1, the fifth is a ratio of 3 to 2, and the fourth is a ratio of 4 to 3. According to Aristotle, Pythagoras and his followers saw number, and number relationships like the ones mentioned above, as the key to understanding the world. And as a consequence, since these number relationships are perfectly expressed in music, they concluded that music itself was the ordering principle of the world. As Aristotle wrote of the Pythagoreans, they supposed the elements of numbers to be the elements of all things, and the whole heaven to be a musical scale and a number. Pythagoras and his followers thus thought that the universe was intelligible, and this implies the existence of intelligence behind it, a logos or mind. And just a little side note here, the word that we use in English, the word ratio, comes from the Latin word ratio, which means reason, just as in Greek, the word logos can mean reason or mind. Further, the ancient Greeks thought that the heavenly bodies themselves produced tones in their rotations, and that man's music was an attempt to approximate this heavenly harmony, and so to participate in the harmony of the universe. And I would note here that even though we now know that this view is not literally true, it could still be held in a more poetic fashion. There's a certain order to the way the heavenly bodies move, to the point where it can often be predicted mathematically. Music, for the Greeks, had a moral aspect. Harmony or disharmony in music could cause harmony or disharmony in the soul. And thus Plato in his Republic wrote, "The overseers of our city must keep a firm grip on our system of education, protecting it above all else, and not allowing it to be destroyed accidentally. They must reject any radical innovation in physical or musical education, preserving them as far as they can unchanged." Then again he writes, "Rhythm and mode penetrate more deeply into the inner soul than anything else does. They have the most powerful effect on it, since they bring gracefulness with them. They make a person graceful if he is rightly brought up, and the opposite if he is not. He will praise what is beautiful and fine. Delighting in it and receiving it into his soul, he will feed on it and so become noble and good." That is what the Greeks thought of music. Cicero, the great Roman statesman, would later take up these same thoughts when he wrote, "What is that great and pleasing sound? That is the concord of tones separated by unequal but nevertheless carefully proportioned intervals, caused by the rapid motion of the spheres themselves. Skilled men imitating this harmony on stringed instruments and in singing have gained for themselves a return to this region, as have those who have cultivated their exceptional abilities to search for divine truths." Notice how Cicero compares musicians with philosophers here and makes this connection between music and philosophy, between the search for truth and the search for beauty. Music can help people come into contact with divine truths. Perhaps this sounds foreign or idealistic to some modern people, but to philosophers like him, a saying like this was commonplace. This elevated understanding of music did not end with the Greeks and the Romans, but continued with the advent of Christianity. There was this one difference, however. For the enlightened pagans, music could transport us to the realm of the spheres, within the cosmos. But for Christians, music had a higher goal, carrying us to heaven itself and to Christ in heaven, outside the cosmos. And Christ, for Christians, is himself the logos, the reason or mind, behind all things. Various early Christian writers speak of this conception of music, among them St. Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century, who speaks of the new song, which surpasses the Orphic myths of the pagans, and the new song is Christ himself. There are 2 other writers from the early church worth mentioning here, Cassiodorus and Boethius. Cassiodorus wrote a book called Institutiones, which among other things references Plato's teaching from hundreds of years before on the moral power of music. Boethius, the author of the famous Consolation of Philosophy, also wrote another book called The Principles of Music, which once again continues this tradition of teaching on music. In fact, it had such a strong influence on Western thinking that it was used for many centuries afterwards. It was the standard music theory textbook at Oxford until 1856. As I said above, this view of music was pretty much the general consensus on music for well over 2,000 years in the West. Just to name one example, Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, as a teenager, wrote words that express his reverence for music that would continue throughout his life. Here's what he wrote. God has given us music so that above all it can lead us upwards. Music unites all qualities. It can exalt us, divert us, cheer us up, or break the hardest of hearts with the softest of its melancholy tones. But its principal task is to lead our thoughts to higher things, to elevate, even to make us tremble. The musical art often speaks in sounds more penetrating than the words of poetry, and takes hold of the most hidden crevices of the heart. Song elevates our being and leads us to the good and the true. If, however, music serves only as a diversion, or as a kind of vain ostentation, it is sinful and harmful. Now, this quote is coming from someone who would later become a notorious atheist, but even then, he would carry a deep reverence for music with him for the rest of his life. Also, notice how he continues the tradition of connecting music and philosophy. They've always shared a deep connection, which is why it should come as no surprise that when the prevailing philosophy of the West shifted towards relativism on all fronts, the ideas about music and the music itself also changed drastically. When you remove God, then meaning disappears and you are left with chaos, with chance. We are now ready to move into the 20th century and discuss the ideas behind the music of John Cage. At this point in the video, you might be a little annoyed with me because I spent so much time on a long history lesson instead of talking about John Cage. But without this context, I think it would be difficult for you to understand why I have a problem with John Cage, and some of you might just accuse me of demonizing the poor guy. I hope to make this analysis as objective as I know how, and I hope you can forgive me for the very lengthy introduction. So here goes. John Milton Cage Jr. was an American composer who lived from 1912 to 1992. His father was an inventor of some ability, and this is a quality that the son certainly inherited from him and took with him into his music making later on, often styling himself more of an inventor than a composer. Cage experimented with various forms of artistic expression as a young man, including painting, although he said that people tended to react better to his music than to his paintings, so he chose to focus on music. As Robert Riley says in his essay, Cage acknowledged 3 influences on his work: the composer Erik Satie, Henry David Thoreau, and Buckminster Fuller. But Riley argues that much more profound is the unacknowledged influence of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he bases this belief on the profound similarities between Cage's ideas and some of Rousseau's ideas. We'll get to Rousseau in just a minute, but first I'd like to very briefly mention 2 other important influences: Arnold Schoenberg and Eastern philosophy. Schoenberg, although he was the inventor of dodecaphonic music, which normalized dissonance and banned consonants as far as possible, still believed in the importance of harmony and tried to teach this to his students. Although Cage worshipped Schoenberg, as he himself says, I think that he ended up going in the opposite direction from his teacher. Whereas Schoenberg's dodecaphonic system is tightly, almost obsessively controlled, Cage ended up choosing to step back and let chance dictate where the music would go, an idea that I think he borrowed from his study of Eastern thought. He would eventually come into contact with the Chinese I Ching, which was a tool used for divination, and appropriate it as a means for determining how his music would go. I think we could go into some of these points in a lot more detail, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his second discourse, and see how it relates to some of Cage's ideas. To quote Robert Riley at length, With his noise, Cage worked out musically the full implications of Rousseau's non-teleological view of nature in his second discourse. Cage did for music what Rousseau did for political philosophy. Perhaps the most profoundly anti-Aristotelian philosopher of the 18th century, Rousseau turned Aristotle's notion of nature on its head. Aristotle said that nature defined not only what man is, but what he should be. Rousseau countered that nature is not an end, a telos, but a beginning. Man's end is his beginning. There is nothing he ought to become, no moral imperative. There is no purpose in man or nature. Existence is therefore bereft of any rational principle. Rousseau asserted that man by nature was not a social or political animal endowed with reason. What man has become is the result not of nature, but of accident. And the society resulting from that accident has corrupted man. According to Rousseau, man was originally isolated in the state of nature, where the pure sentiment of his own existence was such that one suffices to oneself, like God. Yet, this self-satisfied God was asocial and pre-rational. Only by accident did man come into association with others. Somehow, this accident ignited his reason. Through his association with others, man lost his self-sufficient sentiment of his own existence. He became alienated. He began to live in the esteem of others instead of in his own self-esteem. Rousseau knew that the pre-rational, asocial state of nature was lost forever, but thought that an all-powerful state could ameliorate the situation of alienated man. The state could restore a simulacrum of that original well-being by removing all man's subsidiary social relationships. By destroying man's familial, social, and political ties, the state could make each individual totally dependent on the state and independent of each other. The state is the vehicle for bringing people together so that they can be apart. A sort of radical individualism under state sponsorship. End very lengthy quote. Now you may ask, why are we talking about Rousseau this much in the first place? Well, because Cage's philosophy is very similar to Rousseau's. He denigrates reason, thinks that having to live in the esteem of others will alienate one from one's own self-esteem, and seeks to remedy this by returning to a pre-rational state. Cage would say things like, I strive toward the non-mental, or I want to provide music that is free from one's memory and imagination. Because Cage lacked a teleological view of nature, then it follows that there is nothing that we ought to become, no perfection to seek. Once again, to quote Riley's essay, of music, Cage said, "The requiring that many parts be played in a particular togetherness is not an accurate representation of how things are in nature, because in nature there is no order. In other words, life's accord is that there is no accord. As a result, Cage desired a society where you can do anything at all. He warned that one has to be as careful as possible not to form any ideas about what each person should or should not do. He was committed to letting everything happen, to making everything that happens acceptable." Thus disappears the traditional view of music as a morally formative force. To tie this all back to the first part of the video, we have two completely opposed philosophies. The ancient Western consensus always assumed a teleological view of nature, where music pointed to the heavenly regions and even to God. But for Cage, there is no rational principle in the world, or in us either, and we need to return to a pre-rational state. I think that explains why we get some pieces by Cage that go like this. Or this. Now, I'm not doing this just to bash Cage. I actually really like his piano piece, In a Landscape, and I'm also aware that some of his music, even though it's extremely innovative, actually uses classical forms to provide a sort of structure, like his concerto for prepared piano. But in this video, I wanted to focus more on the philosophy behind his music, and not so much on the music itself because of time constraints. The point I'm trying to make here is that John Cage introduced a new philosophy about what music was, and the traditional Western understanding of music became a minority opinion. I think this subject deserves a much fuller treatment, especially I think that I could have gone into John Cage's music in this video, but I purposely didn't do that because I wanted to focus more on his philosophy. I think his music could use a much fuller pass than I gave it, especially because there's so much more to it than I talk about here. But I'm mainly focusing on the philosophical aspects of it. So, I'll end this video by trying to answer the question that I asked in the title. Did John Cage's ideas ruin music? I think that at the very least, they certainly helped to contribute to its disintegration in the 20th century. As a side note, I also think that John Cage's ideas also helped to contribute to the disintegration of modern dance in the 20th century, since he was also very heavily involved with that. If there's no rational principle in nature or in us, then why does our music need to be orderly and organized and have some kind of harmony to it? It doesn't. If there's no music of the spheres and no meaning to the universe, then our music will eventually degenerate into noise, or in Cage's case, notes determined by the rolling of a die, basically. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. And I hope that my first attempt to explain this subject wasn't too terrible. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.